Welcome to 4RG Meets, another 4RG Meets, and we are happy that you could all come and join us this evening. It was such a great day out there. I hope you all got out and took advantage of that sunshine. I was curling earlier in the day, so even though I was having fun, I was missing out on the sunshine. But a very, very nice day, and we're glad to have you here today. We've got another great speaker lined up for you tonight. We have Stephen Bocking, who has kindly volunteered to give us an introduction to the workings and effectiveness of carbon capture or carbon sequestration, as you may know it. And it's something that's getting a lot more attention in social media as well as in TV and radio. And in fact, it was on one of the commercials at the Super Bowl last night, if you were tuned into that. So it is definitely a apropos topic for this time. I'm going to turn it over to Beth for a moment. Oh, by the way, I'm Scott McKinley. Forgot to do that part. I'm Scott McKinley. This is Beth McKinley. And Beth's going to tell you a little bit about for our grandchildren in general.
Yeah, so for those of you who may be here for the first time, we are For Our Grandchildren, also known as 4RG. We are a volunteer climate action group, and you don't have to be a grandparent to be involved. As Scott likes to say, we are all grandchildren here. We're based in Peterborough, also known as Nogojiwanong in one of the local Indigenous languages. But you don't have to live here to be a part of 4RG either. Our mission is to inspire people, to inform people about the climate crisis, and to mobilize people to take effective action in response in whatever way is possible. And there's so many things. The transformation requires so many skills. And climate communicators have said that one of the most important things that we can do is just to talk about it. And that's why we're here now. So 4RG Meets is our monthly meeting. We gather online, usually the second Monday of the month, unless there's a holiday, to learn and talk about all aspects of climate change and our response to it. Most of our meetings are recorded and they're uploaded to our website. And we have had so many fabulous speakers volunteer their time with us, including tonight's speaker, that, if you ever have a little bit of time and you want to browse through the last 2 years, it's been 2 years now.
2 years, yeah.
2 years of recordings. There's such great content there. Cue the invitation for volunteers. If you would like to become more involved, you can reach out to us through our webpage. And you will be contacted by Connie McCracken. She is our volunteer coordinator. And she will want to have a wee chat with you to find out what you're interested in, what you like to do, and where you might fit into the group. You can check us out on Facebook. We have a page and a private group. We also have a presence on Instagram, which is apparently where all the cool kids are hanging out. So of course we're there. Our website has loads of information, announcements about upcoming events, suggested actions, and as I think I mentioned, recordings, yes, I did, of our previous meetings. So next month, our presentation will be brought to us by Guy. So Guy, if you would unmute yourself and tell us a little bit about what will be happening in March.
I hope that we're going to be able to put together a session which will allow us to practice talking to other people about climate change. So I've entitled, I think I've called it something about your cranky uncle. If your cranky uncle shows up for dinner and you want to open up the conversation about talking with him about climate change, we're going to practice doing things like that. So we hope to make it very interactive next week. So we'll all have a chance to practice in small groups, talking to each other and listening to each other to hear what we could say about climate change. It'll be based a lot on what Catherine Hayhoe has to say about that topic when she says that talking about this is the most important thing we can do, and we all have the opportunity to talk to people all the time. So we're going to try that next week, and we're going to make it as interactive as we possibly can.
Great, thank you, Guy. And we do want to mix things up a little bit moving forward and create more opportunities for people to share their ideas and listen in small groups. So next month will be our initial attempt, our pilot project with Guy. And we'll continue with that moving forward, but we'll also continue to bring in amazing presenters who can offer their expertise. So April, we're looking at a collaboration. It's not confirmed yet, so I won't say names, but the topic will be eco anxiety and eco grief, and just how do we hold that? How do we live with that and not get overwhelmed by that? So before we move on, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that Scott and I and the local members of For Our Grandchildren live on land covered by the Williams Treaty. This is the traditional territory of the Nishisagig and the Chippewa nations. And I'd like to respectfully acknowledge their role as stewards and caretakers of these lands and waters and all living beings in the past, the present, and into the future. And Scott and I became involved with For Our Grandchildren because it allows us to contribute to these efforts and also to honor the calls to action outlined in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Stephen Bocking is a professor emeritus in the Trent School of the Environment. He has taught at Trent since 1994, and although he retired last July, he continues to do some teaching there, and he's doing some teaching here tonight with us. Over the last 2 years, he has taught courses on science and politics, environmental history, the global environment, and the Trent campus environment. His main research interests are the history of our relationship with the environment and the roles of science and other forms of knowledge in environmental affairs. So please welcome Stephen Bocking.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it, seeing all of you, and I hope what I have to say will be of interest and useful to everyone here present. I just wanted to start too by giving a special thank you to Patricia Morton, who was kind of initiated, I think, this invitation for me to speak to you folks tonight. So I just wanted to express my thanks to Patricia for making this connection in the first place. So yes, what I'm going to be talking about tonight, for hopefully not too long, is about carbon capture and its relevance to the climate change crisis and impending catastrophe, and the extent I'll try to talk especially about the extent to which it could provide a meaningful, at least partial solution to the carbon and the climate change challenge. So we can start, of course, with just noting the climate emergency itself. And this is something that I really don't need to spend any time on, because I know you folks are intimately aware of and knowledgeable about this, about the prospect of a climate catastrophe in coming decades. We've seen already over the last few years increasing evidence that that we are running basically the planetary environment as kind of a casino. We're taking a massive gamble with the future of the planet and the future of the well-being of future generations. We can see that in a variety of contexts, in the accelerated climate change that's underway in the Arctic, as Inuit leaders like Sheila Watt-Cloutier have highlighted, in the wildfires and the destruction of the town of Lytton in the interior of British Columbia just in July of 2021, or even more recently in August 2022, the massive flooding that occurred in Pakistan that was devastating for perhaps 20 to 30 million people across much of Pakistan. And again, this flooding catastrophe just last August kind of provided a powerful reminder of how those folks, particularly in the global south, who have the least responsibility for creating the climate catastrophe, will likely be those who experience the worst consequences of it. So I think it's always very important, as I talk about in my course on the global environment, to keep in mind that climate change is, among other things, a matter of global environmental justice. So the climate emergency, at any rate, to a large extent, we can think of it in terms of the urgent requirement, the urgent need to reduce the content of carbon and other greenhouse gases, but especially carbon, especially in the form of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so that leads to the obvious question: how do we go about reducing the content of carbon in the atmosphere? We're currently at about 455 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. That's an increase of from about 280 parts per million that was present before the Industrial Revolution. And that concentration of carbon continues to increase year by year. So if we want to reduce carbon in the atmosphere, there's basically two options. We can put less carbon in the atmosphere in the first place, and the ways of doing so are pretty well established and quite familiar, I think. We need to reduce our use of fossil fuels, our burning of fossil fuels. We need to have an accelerated shift towards forms of clean energy. So there are well-established ways of reducing carbon in the atmosphere by simply not putting so much carbon in the atmosphere. But there's also been increasing discussion about the other side of the equation of taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And that's what the topic for tonight is, of prospects and possibilities of using technologies of various kinds to actually take carbon out of the atmosphere. There's a variety of strategies that we can employ to do so. One familiar way is simply to plant more trees. Trees are kind of the original technology of carbon capture in a sense, because as everybody knows, trees and plants in general, they're highly effective. They've evolved over hundreds of millions of years. Carbon in the form of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and then to breathe out oxygen. And so they are kind of the original carbon technology. And that's reflected in some initiatives for planting trees, such as the federal government's current 2 billion trees commitment, providing various incentives to encourage people to plant trees. So that's one option. But what I'm going to be mainly focusing on tonight is what I call industrial carbon capture and storage. And that's basically the incorporation of strategies for extracting carbon and storing carbon in industrial processes. And so that's something that has been gaining increasing amount of attention, particularly because it can be, it's tremendously expensive. So it involves a lot of issues about financial priorities, about who is going to pay for these technologies, about who's going to share in the expenses, and so forth. So that's those are the, as always, the most contentious issues involve money, finances, and so that's a major reason why there is so much debate these days about industrial carbon capture and storage. The basic storyline of carbon capture, industrial carbon capture and storage, is it's fairly straightforward. The story starts in industrial facilities that produce carbon dioxide, such as cement plants, steel plants, power stations that produce electricity by burning fossil fuels, either natural gas or coal or oil. And all these kinds of industrial facilities, in their normal course of operations, they release copious, many millions, billions of tons of carbon dioxide. And the idea is to capture this carbon dioxide before it's released from the industrial facility, capture it, concentrate it, purify it, and then direct it into pipeline, and basically send it to a geologically suitable area where it'll then be pumped deep underground, 2 kilometers or more underground, into stable geological formations that can provide long-term reliable storage for the carbon dioxide. And the idea basically is to ensure the permanent sequestration or storage of carbon dioxide deep underground, basically so that it will stay forever out of sight and out of mind. And so that's the basic storyline. Of course, the devil is always in the details, to use a well-worn cliche. But nevertheless, that is the basic idea, to extract carbon from industrial facilities before it's released into the atmosphere, send it underground so that it will not contribute to the climate crisis. Now, in terms of who's interested in investing in carbon capture and storage, there are various interests, various parties that have expressed to varying degrees interest in carbon capture. Some of the most prominent players in the whole carbon capture and storage field are carbon-intensive industries. That is, industries that produce a great deal of carbon dioxide and seek to achieve kind of a social license to continue their activities by demonstrating that they are taking effective action on their carbon dioxide production. So cement factories, for example, the cement industry has an active interest in carbon capture. Cement plants like the one on the left here are among the largest producers of carbon dioxide of any category of industrial facility in the world. It's estimated that about 8% of global carbon emissions are produced only simply by plants that make cement. So it's been calculated that if cement was a country, then it would be the third biggest national producer of carbon dioxide in the world today. So it's enormously significant. The steel industry as well is another important producer of carbon dioxide. About 6 or 7% of global carbon dioxide is produced by the steel industry. So they also have an interest in finding ways of continuing to operate while reducing their production of carbon dioxide. And then the fossil fuel power industry is interested as well. Power companies in China, in India, in the United States, in Western Canada, and elsewhere that burn coal or oil or natural gas, but especially coal, have an active interest in modifying their facilities so that the carbon dioxide, which they now release into the atmosphere, is instead captured and stored in underground. So various carbon-intensive industries are among the most active proponents then of carbon capture and storage. Another category of interests that have an active interest in, or at least express an active interest in carbon capture is the Canadian oil industry. And in particular, several of the leading Canadian oil companies, especially that are active in the Alberta oil sands, have joined together in the Pathways Alliance to form kind of a single kind of collective that is advocating for investment in a large-scale facility for carbon capture and storage that will become part of the Alberta oil sands operations. They've made a proposal for a project that would perhaps it is intended to store about 22 million tons of carbon each year, and at a cost of $16.5 billion. And I've been told that they even had a commercial on last night's Super Bowl to promote their idea. And they are very active in pushing for broad kind of public acceptance of their proposal for a carbon capture project in the Alberta oil sands, particularly because they are very keen to obtain government support for this Pathways Alliance proposal, that they would like to see the federal and provincial governments, the Alberta and Canadian governments, pay for perhaps 2/3 of the $16.5 billion that this project may cost. This itself has elicited a certain amount of criticism because the same industry that is seeking a large-scale subsidy for the Pathways Alliance proposal has also, over the last 2 years or so, achieved profits on the range of about $50 billion. So the argument is made that, well, perhaps they would be able to afford a project like this out of their own pockets. At least that is the argument that is made in response to the Canadian oil industry's expressed interest in carbon capture. There are a few projects that are underway now in industrial carbon capture and storage in Canada. Probably the leading one that there's already a fairly substantial record is the Boundary Dam coal-fired power station in Saskatchewan, and that's a picture of it there, that for a number of years it's been capturing a part of the carbon dioxide released by burning coal and storing the carbon and then sending it by pipeline underground. And it's been seen as kind of a demonstration of the potential for industrial carbon capture and storage in the Canadian context. And it's one of a number of projects. There's about 5 or 6 projects of various sizes across Canada, well, mainly in Western Canada, that are underway now, that are basically intended to prove the feasibility of the concept. The Canadian and Alberta government have also expressed support for carbon capture and storage, and to some extent have provided funding to back up their express support for carbon capture and storage. They've been providing for a number of years various subsidies, like, for example, financing research into carbon capture technologies. They also provide various incentives, particularly, probably the most significant one is the carbon tax itself, which in effect provides an incentive for carbon capture, because as industries have to pay starting at $40 a ton or so for the carbon that they produce, with that amount gradually increasing year by year, that provides a built-in incentive for industries to find another way of disposing of their carbon other than releasing it, thereby saving that carbon tax. And so that in effect makes the idea, at least, that it makes carbon capture more economically feasible for industries that otherwise would produce carbon, that they invest in carbon capture so that they don't have to pay the carbon tax. But probably the largest effort in the federal area, at least, was put in place in the April 22nd, 2022 budget, last year's federal budget, where they the federal government proposed an investment tax credit for carbon capture and storage, and which involves basically the federal government providing a credit for up to half of the cost of the technology required for carbon capture. And it's estimated that this is a tax credit that could cost perhaps around $1.5 billion per year. So in effect, it would provide a direct subsidy for investment in carbon capture technologies by the oil industry and by other industries across the country that produce large quantities of carbon dioxide. But as I've already mentioned, the Pathways Alliance sees these current subsidies and incentives and tax credits as basically only the first step in what they would like to see happen. They would like to see a much greater degree of government support for industrial carbon and capture, on an entirely different scale. And among the arguments that they use to make this case is they point to the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, which includes pretty substantial subsidies for carbon capture. President Biden's administration has kind of gone into this in a fairly substantial way. And so the Canadian oil industry is arguing that that Canada should at least match the subsidies that the American government is providing to the American oil industry. I think with some reflection, we could perhaps conclude that the argument for that Canada needs to be competitive with American subsidies is kind of incoherent, because it's hard to imagine a situation where, say, the Canadian oil industry would simply pick up the Alberta oil sands and move it to the United States in order to benefit from the American subsidies. So issues about international competitiveness, it's hard to see how that really applies. And yet it's a rhetorically very powerful argument to make that can often sound quite persuasive, I think. So this, in short, is kind of the basic landscape of those who seek to make the case for carbon capture, basically to ensure that there's a continued social license for carbon-intensive industries, and to ensure that there is ample government support for carbon capture by the Canadian oil industry. Now, there's also been a considerable amount of expressed opposition to, not necessarily to carbon capture and storage itself, but to the idea of the federal government especially having a large role in financing carbon capture and storage. And various environmental groups have expressed their concern for the federal government having a large role in subsidizing carbon capture and storage. One of the more prominent expressions of concern about federal plans for subsidizing carbon capture and storage was a letter from signed by about 400 university scientists and other academic researchers, including a number of energy researchers. A letter that was written in January 2022 to the Minister of Finance, arguing that the federal government should really think twice about providing tax credits or other subsidies to carbon capture and storage, because they see this these kinds of tax credits as simply continuing the long history of, in Canada and in other countries, of providing subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, which it's argued is kind of one of the main reasons in which we got into a climate emergency in the first place. I was actually one of the 400 or so academics who signed this letter back in January 2022, and I was glad to have the opportunity to do so. There's various concerns and objections to carbon capture that were expressed in this letter and have been expressed by environmental organizations ever since. One objection is that the projections and promises of carbon capture, in practice, they haven't really come true yet. That the hope for benefits of carbon capture projects have not really met the expectations attached to these projects. The Boundary Dam coal-fired power station, for example, in Saskatchewan, that I already mentioned, it was projected to capture more than 90% of the carbon dioxide released by that part of the power plant that was connected to the carbon capture facility, but it's really struggled to capture 2/3 of the carbon dioxide released by that part of the facility. And that's been the general experience of carbon capture projects, that they simply haven't achieved the hope for efficiencies in capturing carbon dioxide. So in effect, they turn out to be much more expensive than projected. Another important objection to carbon capture, at least to the carbon capture that's been put in place so far, is that carbon capture so far has been chiefly used not so much to reduce carbon emissions, but to increase oil production. About 9/10 or 90% of the carbon that so far has been injected into the ground in order to store it away from the atmosphere has been injected into operating oil, producing oil fields, and basically the carbon dioxide injected into the ground used to force out oil from the oil fields in order to extend the life of those oil fields. So that's a process known as enhanced oil recovery. And in fact, the carbon dioxide captured at the Boundary Dam station, it's sent by pipeline to an oil field, injected into the ground in order to increase oil production in that oil field. And many observers, note how carbon capture is actually used then to increase oil production, and made the reasonable argument that perhaps, to put it politely, that's somehow missing the point of carbon capture. And that just speaks to kind of the larger issue, I think, with carbon capture, that many critics have suggested that that carbon capture and storage may, in effect, delay effective action on the climate catastrophe, because it may extend fossil fuel use. It could do so by basically providing kind of a green seal of approval to operations that are highly carbon intensive, such as the oil sands industry, by making as a basis for making the argument that in fact the oil sands, say, are in fact environmentally friendly after all, and therefore don't need to have any kind of a plan for a transition for oil sands workers to other forms of employment. And then also the subsidies that carbon capture requires may distract from the real investments that are needed in other forms of climate action, incentives for home energy efficiency or for electric vehicles or for renewable energy, the whole array of clean energy and of climate-friendly technologies and social practices and so forth that often need a little bit of financial support at the outset to get them going, but that, given that governments don't have unlimited funds to call on, that those may not be properly financed because so much government resources will be going instead to subsidizing carbon capture, particularly if the Pathways Alliance is successful in obtaining a large-scale subsidy for their proposed project. And then more generally, as that letter from academics made the case that globally, governments around the world provide several $100 billion a year in subsidies to the fossil fuel industry around the world. And as I said, the scale of subsidies of the fossil fuel industry, of making the burning of oil and coal and natural gas much cheaper than it otherwise would be, that's a big part of what got us into the climate emergency in the first place. And government subsidies for carbon capture then, it could be argued, is simply continuing that historical tradition of subsidizing fossil fuel production. There's no reason why the fossil fuel industry could not support carbon capture investments itself with the enormous profits that the oil industry has made, particularly with the high price of oil and of gasoline these days. The oil industry has made profits beyond anyone's comprehension over the last couple of years. There is no shortage of funds there in the industry itself. And that just raises the question of why governments need to provide subsidies to an industry that is incredibly productive these days, producing profits globally that, again, are in the hundreds of billions of dollars a year. And that, just finally, all this adds up to, I think, how we think of carbon capture and storage in terms of like innovative technology intended to, an example of using technology to solve a particular problem. But what carbon capture and storage is fundamentally, I think, is it's not so much an environmental technology, but it's a political technology. It's a technology that's intended to solve a really challenging political problem in the Canadian context. The big problem with effective climate action today is that there are interests in various parts of the country that have an active opposition to really effective action on climate change. Proposals for climate action often risk kind of making more difficult, more challenging tensions between Western Canada and Eastern Canada. Certain provinces, especially Alberta and Saskatchewan, are often very resistant to effective climate action, particularly the current Alberta government. And carbon capture and storage and the current federal subsidies for carbon capture are kind of a way of making the political argument that that the federal government acknowledges the particular concerns of Western Canada, especially Alberta and Saskatchewan. And so in effect, they're an effort. I see carbon capture subsidies as less an effort to solve a climate challenge and more an effort to solve a political challenge of trying to ensure nationwide support for climate action. So it's important to view that, carbon capture subsidies then, as I said, as a political technology more than an environmental technology, in effect, to try to achieve kind of a balancing act between the urgent need for effective climate action and the need to achieve national support for climate action. And so, that's one way of viewing carbon capture generally. It's basically another instance of how the Canadian federal system is so often about achieving a delicate balance between competing and often conflicting regional interests, between different parts of the country that see their economic future in different ways, that have different political priorities. And so in that kind of a sense, carbon capture reflects a particular kind of political calculation than a political balancing act. But as a balancing act, we can also see it as, in effect, not just a balancing act, but really kind of a dangerous gamble. And the gamble is that carbon capture, by putting so much of our chips on the table on a bet, placing chips on a bet that carbon capture will be an effective strategy, it's a big gamble, because if it doesn't come true, if carbon capture is delayed or doesn't work as effectively as it might, or if it turns out to be far more expensive than it's thought to be, that in effect, could result in us losing valuable years, a valuable opportunity to take more effective action sooner on the climate challenge. And so, in short, we need to weigh very carefully whether this is a gamble that we want to make with the well-being of future generations. So that's basically what I wanted to say tonight. So I just wanted to say thank you, everyone, for listening. I hope it was useful and interesting. And finally, just in keeping with the theme for our grandchildren, I just wanted to express the greetings from my recently arrived grandson. And I hope you found this interesting, and I would welcome any questions you might have. So thank you for your attention.
That's an awesome picture of your grandson. What a
He's very photogenic.
He is extremely photogenic, yes, to be young. So before we open things up to discussion and comments and questions, there's been a lot going on in the chat. I'd just like to invite John Woodger, who is a member of the 4RG Communications Committee, to say a few words.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen, for your presentation tonight, and to answer your question at the end. It was very useful and very interesting. I knew extremely little about the subject, and this has been most clarifying indeed. I mean, I had a sense that cement and steel and fossil fuels are implicated, unsurprisingly. But what I think I appreciated the most was the warning that this is not going to be a magic bullet, as we all would love to see arise, and this is not going to be it. And I think we now have an understanding of why Canadian oil is a big supporter. So I think that this has been very educational for us, because we now have a sense that politically this is going to be used by certain people for certain reasons, and that may or may not be helpful to the rest of us and to the environment as a whole. So thank you so much for coming out tonight and presenting us with this information. I really do appreciate that.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you.
I just want to echo what John said. He said that very well and better than I would have. So,
thank you, Scott.
Okay, some of our questions that we have here. Well, I think one's more of a rhetorical question here at the beginning, and we were talking about the trees and planting more trees, and the comment was, how about we cut fewer trees, which is clearly a good point as well. Will the forests burn up as climate warms? Have you heard about the carbon capture rail car that can be towed on trains? Sounds brilliant. So there's a couple of questions wrapped up in there. I have heard that as well. That as the temperature increases, the likelihood of forest burning is more likely, and so that just contributes to the problem. So do you have anything to say about that?
Absolutely, and that's something that's really worth underlining, that there are huge carbon stocks in the world's forests, not least in Canada's boreal forest. One of the largest forests in the world. It's estimated that boreal forest, the global boreal forest, contains something like 200 billion tons of carbon, and that's about the equivalent of 6 or 7 years of the total global carbon emissions by the entire human population. And if that goes up in smoke, then that would be just on the other side of catastrophe. And so it just underlines the need to really ensure that we care for and protect and manage appropriately the Canada's boreal forests, as well as forests in the rest of the world. So you know, among other places like the tropical rainforests of the world. There's enormous concerns about the state of the Amazon basin in Brazil, for example, and that you know, it was good news for the climate earlier this year that the Brazil got a new president who has a commitment to protecting the Amazon rainforest, and we can only hope that they're going to put in place more effective protection for the Amazon rainforest than the previous president over the last few years in Brazil had in place. So it's this gets back to how trees are the original carbon capture technology, and we need to do much more to safeguard that technology.
Have you heard of the second part of that question about the carbon capture rail car? I've never heard of it.
I confess that I did. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mention about that, but I confess I have not heard about that. I am curious, but I don't know about the rail car carbon capture technology.
Ruth Perkins, can you elaborate on that at all? Maybe not.
Hi, I read an article about it. It's a rail car that is attached to existing trains. And as the train, it can be attached to any train anywhere in the world, of which there are millions running around right now. And it has an intake, air intake at the front of it, and it has a carbon capture technology in it. So as the train moves, it captures air and pulls the carbon out of the air and stores it. And then it can be taken off of the rail car when it at an appropriate station.
Okay,
Well, that is interesting.
that is interesting. I could imagine that would be perhaps more energy efficient than direct, like most, I think, experiments for direct air capture of carbon, like straight from the air, involve a lot of fans and so forth, like to basically to suck in the air. And so I guess that would be more energy efficient. So, but yeah, I'll have to look up that myself. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
So the next comment is Philip Keinholz, and he is putting in a resource, Sisyphus Science and Carbon Removal by Sophia Greaves. That's an online article, I believe, and then also The State of Carbon Dioxide Removal by Stephen Smith. So if you're interested in those, go into the chat and just jot that down. Marilyn Freeman says, on February 9th, 23, the International Institute for Sustainable Development issued a report, carbon capture technology is too expensive and will take too long to build. The IPCC identifies carbon capture utilization storage, CCUS, as the most costly and least direct option in addressing climate change. The Canadian government is prioritizing CCUS because the oil and gas industry we just scrolled up and we lost the last part of that comment. Still, I can't read it.
Okay.
Let's move it up just a touch.
That part doesn't march on.
Oh, because the oil and gas industry has them by the neck. How can we change that? Yeah, excellent question, Marilyn.
Sorry, was there a question?
Basically,
I
think basically what just if I can read it again, what Marilyn's getting at is, yeah, the Canadian government is beholden to the oil and gas industry. So how do we change this? Marilyn, if you want to speak up and clarify if I haven't correctly summarized that, please do.
You have totally correctly summarized it. And I was being polite when I said, has the government by the neck? I could have used other terms.
Yeah. I mean, the best response is always to simply to make the government very clear on understand clearly where you're coming from, that the you know, there are many opportunities, especially in part by responding to the calls of actions of various environmental organizations that are active in this area, like 4RG, as well as like organizations such as Environmental Defense, which has been really active on this issue, and simply to make the government very clear about what your view is on this issue. And certainly, I I really like the government basically is making the political calculation that that carbon investment in carbon capture and storage is basically necessary for climate action more generally to be politically feasible. The federal environment minister is a long-time, highly experienced environmental activist in a sense, and with a really established record, and he doesn't need to show that he's got his environmental heart in the right place, I think. And the fact that he has been a really active supporter of carbon capture reflects, I think, a calculation that took place around the cabinet table in Ottawa that is simply necessary to invest in carbon capture in order to make the whole federal climate strategy politically saleable across the country. So I think that implies then that there's an opportunity to make the federal government very aware that that there is a large constituency of people who are also quite skeptical of these kinds of investments, or at least would make the argument that that the balance of federal investments have to go towards other strategies that are, I think will likely be much more effective and much more efficient in actually reducing our production of greenhouse gases, investing in providing incentives for clean energy and those and that kind of thing. So my basic point is that what we have here is essentially simply a political calculation, and anyone who cares about the issue has to put their thumb on the particular scales that the government is weighing this issue on, so that they know what the true feeling of people across the country is about this.
Yeah, it's our silence will cost us if we say.
Literally, it will cost us.
Yeah. So Esther / Mark, it says, wouldn't the cost to the environment of using fuel for ships to transport carbon exceed the value of this method? And she also asks, drilling more holes in the ground for storage doesn't sound environmentally friendly.
I think that's a really good point to make, that in the calculation of the climate efficiency of carbon capture and storage, as often as not, the carbon emissions of all the machinery and so forth required for basically what is building an additional large-scale industrial facility with ships, with building a pipeline, drilling holes and so forth, that can often take up a pretty substantial fraction of the eventual savings in carbon of these technologies. I think they've been able to make a fairly persuasive case that it's not necessarily outweighed. It's not like it doesn't take more carbon than they're storing, but it certainly detracts from the overall carbon efficiency of this technology. Among other things, probably the most expensive part of the whole technology is building the brand new pipelines that are necessary to carry carbon dioxide away from the industrial facilities to the appropriate geological formations. That can be very require a lot of energy to build, and also raise often pretty substantial political complexities too, because people don't usually like to see a pipeline crisscross the countryside for obvious reasons.
If I could just ask a technical question kind of relating to that. What is the form of the carbon when they put it underground in these geological structures? How is it being held there?
Well, when they inject it into the ground, it's often liquefied, and so basically sent in that kind of form, and basically then it can be sent into a deep saline aquifer deep underground, and so basically react with the moisture in the ground. And my understanding is it basically would create an entire kind of an enormous reservoir of soda pop deep underground, carbon infused liquid in effect, which would be stable in for the long term, or would otherwise react chemically with geological formation. So basically it would become part of the geological formation.
Okay. Comment, the feds have committed 9.2 billion to date for CCUS. Imagine what this money could do invested in renewables. Thank you, Marilyn. Arthur says, what about carbon capture and not storage?
Well, I think the idea is that if the carbon is going to be captured, then something has to be done with it. And the idea is to take the carbon and basically get it out of our system, get it away from the atmosphere. And the only place where that is seen as a kind of a long-term solution is deep underground. So storage is kind of the other half of the equation, that once the carbon is captured, it has to be put somewhere, and so it has to be stored somewhere for the long term.
Right.
Right. Patrick Macaulay says, assuming that carbon capture and storage can be done in a practical and scalable manner, and he realizes that's a big assumption, it makes sense to use it for industries like concrete, since the end product does not generate greenhouse gases once it's produced. So do you see any way that we or the government, whoever, make it available for this type of industry, but prohibit it for use in the fossil fuel industry?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because certainly, it's there's a lot of work going on in trying to find alternatives, like especially to cement. And so, like, you can see a number of buildings around Toronto that are currently under construction where the basic framework of the buildings is wood rather than cement. They're building buildings up to 12 stories tall so far that are basically made out of wood. And so that's and useful kind of experiments to try to reduce our consumption of cement. So that's one strategy to deal with the fact that cement is inherently carbon intensive. There's also some efforts underway to power cement factories, cement plants, only using renewable energy. And there's a cement plant in Sweden where they're going to power it entirely through by using wind turbines, for example. But it's impossible to produce cement without producing some carbon dioxide, because it's inherent in the whole production of, you take limestone and you add other materials to make cement, and part of the process involves releasing carbon dioxide. So there's probably a role for carbon capture and storage in industries like that it cannot be entirely become entirely carbon free. What I think would have to happen is, I think that carbon capture and storage for those industries that absolutely require it, that simply has to become part of the cost of doing business. That just as, in the normal course of things, making cement or any other industrial product doesn't rely on government subsidies, neither should the carbon capture part of the industrial process. That should simply be included in the cost of buying cement or buying steel. And that simply would be, in doing so, it would make cement more expensive, but that would also provide an incentive to develop alternatives to using cement, or figuring out ways of using less cement in construction or other things. Or so it could provide, the appropriate kind of signals to develop other ways of building things than using cement. So there is a future in certain limited situations for carbon capture and storage, but that doesn't necessarily have to imply that the government needs to take a large role in financing those activities, when there's just a heck of a lot of other things the government could be paying, could be spending money on, whether it's climate action, encouraging renewable energy, or any other social priority we could imagine.
Thank you. And that idea of the company incurring the cost and passing that on to the consumer, that kind of underlies the importance of some of these international agreements where you get agreement across markets around the world that that's the way we're going to approach it, as opposed to, you know, this company going out of business in one country because they don't have the same environmental standards in another country. So that's
Absolutely.
lot.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm going to interrupt for a second. It is 8 o'clock. So for those of you that do have other commitments, you may have to leave at this point, but we definitely are going to continue on with these questions and the discussion. And so everybody's certainly welcome to stay. For those that do have to leave, and that for those that leave over the next little while, thank you once again for everybody coming out and listening to this. I know for me it was a great awakening to what exactly is going on out there and what some of the strategies are, and politics versus the technology, and yeah. So thanks very much again for coming out, everyone, and thanks for our speaker coming out. But we will continue with these questions.
Yeah. This next question is from Patrick McCauley, and it's one I've been really wondering about. Patrick says, using carbon capture and storage to capture carbon from industrial processes is reducing the amount of new emissions. Are there projects underway to extract carbon that's already in the atmosphere?
Yeah, that's a good question. And there are some experiments underway to do so, including here in Canada. That's mainly on a much smaller scale so far. But there are some experiments, like out in British Columbia, there's a pilot project being developed to basically to suck in air and extract the carbon dioxide from it. There's efforts like in Iceland, for example, to try to experiment with that. I wonder how much of a contribution that will make, because it's fairly energy intensive practice, I think. I mean, you know, especially because, you know, carbon dioxide is, you know, it's not a very big part of the air around us, you know, 455 million parts per million. So it takes a certain amount of energy to concentrate it out of the air. On the other hand, there are new technologies, you know, nanotechnologies, for example, that might make this more efficient. So it's one of those things in the future that might become more significant, but it's not yet really on the horizon, I don't think, on any kind of the scale that we need. But I think, yeah, it's a technology that's worth having an open mind about, I think. So we'll just have to wait and see.
Rosemary Ganley says that after your intensive study and your fair presentation of the two sides, what are your recommendations?
My recommendation, you know, like any typical academic, I try to avoid providing concrete recommendations. I say, well, this is what I know, and so, you know, whatever you think makes sense, it's fine with me. But I would say that with respect to the specific, that I would not say that, you know, carbon capture and storage is not should be simply discarded. But what I think is that that I think of it in terms of whether it should be a priority for government funding. And I think if those industries want to invest in carbon capture and storage, those industries that produce a lot of carbon want to invest in carbon capture and storage, then go crazy. Sure, absolutely. I mean, the Canadian oil industry is producing tens of billions of dollars of profits. It'd be lovely if they spent some of their money on carbon capture and storage rather than share buybacks and, you know, enriching their shareholders that are already doing really well. But that doesn't, so industry, as part of the larger idea, the novel idea that industry should actually pay for the damage it causes, by all means invest in carbon capture and storage, but that doesn't mean that it has to become an official government responsibility to pay for these investments. It's industry that is creating the problem in the first place, and industry should absolutely feel free to clean up its own mess.
Yeah. Guy, I almost feel like I want you to read your comment because I can just hear you saying it, and I think the
Oh, I
others
do.
need to have that experience.
I'm actually quite surprised, Stephen, that the muted tone of your conversation tonight compared with the letter, which I have in front of me, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I want to read the last paragraph out to everybody here because it says, deploying CCUS at any climate relevant scale carried out within the short time frame we have to avert climate catastrophe without posing substantial risks to communities in the front lines of the build out is a pipe dream. We must instead move forward with proven climate solutions that will contribute to the most emissions reductions, increased electrification, wide-scale use of renewable energy, and intensifying energy efficiency. And I kind of have a feeling that if we were out for a beer somewhere, that would be our conversation would go somewhat more like that than the conversation that you're having with the 40 of us on this call. Can you explain why maybe it's just me, maybe I had expectations of you being a radical out there to punch the government into submission. What's different?
Well, I mean, you know, I signed that letter, and I certainly agree with all the sentiments expressed in the letter, and I think it's we have an overwhelming urgency to invest in technologies and strategies that are proven and can be implemented tomorrow, or at least the day after tomorrow, rather than along the really long time frames that carbon capture and storage require, you know. But as far as like, I'm not sure, maybe we're getting into an issue of
Yeah,
personal style here, because it's I'd make a lousy preacher. I'm not the kind of banging on the pulpit kind of person. I'm just not there.
Yeah.
But I would make the I do want to stress that there are many investments that would be more effective than carbon capture and storage that the government should be investing in, and then I'll just add several exclamation points after that sentence. How's that?
That's good.
And we have Guy here for further exclamation points.
Well, yeah, and as I said before we started, Stephen, I was looking forward to hearing from a kind of a more nuanced perspective, and I'm a little disappointed that you didn't come out a little harder, but but it's okay. I get it, and I understand what you're saying. It's a political calculation, not based on physics, or economics, but based on politics. And I think you're right that, and I hope Rosemary does get to the chance to go down to the convention in Ottawa and say your politics might be one thing, but it's wrong. Physics, you can't argue with physics, and the physics says that, and economics says this is not the right way to go.
Well, come with me.
I will, Rosemary. Just when are you going? Maybe I'll be there anyway.
Good.
Okay. Marion X says, excellent presentation, very clear and informative. Thank you. Philip Kleinholtz, sorry, my eyes. Questions arise about industrial projects, quote, solving the problem of climate change / social inequality / species extinction. They're interlocked issues. The industrial capitalist mindset is the source of the problem. Unlikely it could kick its growth addiction. It is the opportunity for profit and their existing technological view that is driving the current mainstream interest in CCS or CDR. I feel like Cheryl Lyon could have also written this comment, or many of us.
Yeah, exactly. Catherine Langley is wondering if your grandson is Paul.
Oh, grandson is son of Paul, yes.
Okay. And there's a link here from Melanie, I'm going to say Melanie K. And
on the railway cars.
Oh, about the railway cars. Okay,
Yeah.
there you are. So
Yeah.
there's that information that we can look up.
Judy Mitchell-Wilson asks, is there any chance of us influencing our government to abandon financing the carbon capture industry, considering Canada's history as a resource extraction industry?
Well, I mean, there's certainly powerful forces that are making their voices known in Ottawa every single day, insisting that the government needs to needs to provide these investments and subsidies and so forth. But I think, like the Pathways Alliance proposal is right in front of the government today, and they're working hard and to make their case, and like to encourage Super Bowl watchers and everybody else to tell the government that let's get behind the good people at Pathways Alliance, and they need our tax dollars and yada yada yada. So simply, those who have a different point of view, who think that there are more responsible ways for the government to spend our money, simply need to make their voices known, and that's through the classical strategies of writing letters and so forth to one's MP, to the effect that that might be effective, maybe directly to the Minister of the Environment, perhaps would be more more likely to be heard, I suppose, and to the Prime Minister, of course. Simply making the government aware of sentiments, and taking advantage of the usual calculus that the government always invokes, that any letter that they receive represents 50 or so people that didn't bother to write a letter but feel the same way, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, your impact is magnified every time you write a letter.
That's so important to remember.
So Rosemary is just mentioning her trip to Ottawa, and is saying that she will be going informed by these Peterborough sessions, and wishes that more of the informed people, many of whom are here, she would get involved in party politics.
Stephen Hill says, "Hi, Stephen. Your presentation was excellent, and I share many of the concerns about the potential of CCUS as a climate solution. My question is about political solutions that you mentioned. The IRA seems to have come about because it contains many incentives for CCUS. It's a novel political solution in that it is enabling other climate solutions. So support for CCUS may not be a zero-sum policy solution, but rather enlarge political support for climate solutions. What's your take on the importance of CCUS incentives in enabling the IRA?" And if you wanted to speak to that, Stephen, if you wanted to say any more before the other Stephen answers.
Stephen, my dad used to say, my mom would always help. I had 3 brothers, and my mom would always try to get us to negotiate and sort each other out. And my dad would say, "Peace at any cost," and he'd give us whatever we wanted to make things quiet around the house. And so I was just thinking, that's my analogy. Is it peace at any cost to move stuff forward? Is it good? Is it good enough because it gets the EV incentives and the solar PV incentives and satisfies Joe Manchin in the IRA?
Yeah.
So that's just my,
No,
that's just one of your thoughts.
Yeah, that's a really important point, Stephen, for sure. That I mean, it's just simply a raw political calculation that you need to have something for everybody who's around the table, so that nobody feels left out, and that carbon capture and storage is a way of getting buy-in for also investments in solar power and wind power, and investments in encouragement for people to buy electric vehicles and all the rest of it. So it's, as I said, it's a political calculation, and I think that implies that that there's an essential role for anybody who has sentiments about what government priorities should be, simply to make their voice heard, so that the political calculation includes those particular preferences, so that, like, even if it turns out that that the federal government would decide that carbon capture and storage incentives are necessary investment, that it could also put more productive investments, give them a higher priority. That if it perceives, say, that there is more support than they thought for clean energy and so forth, then they would perhaps, rather than spending X dollars on carbon capture and storage and the same amount on renewable energy, they might spend 3 times more on renewable energy than on carbon capture and storage. So it's as I said in my talk, it's a balancing act, and that means that there is an onus on people who have a particular view on one side of the balancing act to add their weight to it, so that the government responds accordingly.
Sorry, Scott, I muted you.
This happens often.
Does Patricia Morton have a question?
Do we have a hand up there?
Do you want to unmute Patricia?
You're still muted.
Okay, there.
There she
All
goes.
right, can you hear me
Yeah.
now?
Yes.
Hey, hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be here and here with Stephen, who's one of my favorite colleagues from Trent from years ago. Just wonderful talk. I just think he's here as an educator tonight, especially, and he's a wonderful educator, but he's not here to espouse a particular point of view, but to show us what we can do. And it's so important what we can do, because I think it's so important for people not to be given information that gives them false hope. And I think from everything that I'm learning about carbon capture and storage and utilization, it is giving a lot of not climate deniers, but maybe climate delayers false hope about, okay, there's no urgency about this at all. This will solve the problem. And I'm hearing this a lot. And I think it's up to us to challenge that with research, obviously, and the kind of research that Stephen is doing and showing us. But my understanding is that right now, there's only something like 7 projects in Canada that are doing carbon capture and storage and utilization, and that most of them are simply utilizing what carbon they capture to re-inject it into the ground, into close to run out carbon or oil wells to produce still more oil. And they're not, from everything that I've read, this is not only a very costly kind of technology, but it's extremely unproven. It does not make sense for us, let alone for the government, to be putting all this money into it. But for people, many people, to be putting so much hope into this, that, okay, this is the solution. Technology will be the solution to this. And I just think that it's not up to educators to tell us what to do. It's up to us as intelligent activists to decide how best to get this across to the public, that we have to decide what is best to do, and that this is urgent, and that there are no silver bullets, and that carbon capture is no silver bullet. That's for sure. And just one more thing I would add is that, as I suggested to Stephen, I don't think we're paying nearly enough attention to the potential of our natural resources, our forests, and our wetlands, and all of our natural resources. Their tremendous natural ability to store and sequester and deal with our emissions at a much less costly fee than any of these high techs. And I'd like to know why the heck we aren't pushing for that. You know, we are environmentalists. We're not only climate activists, but we're environmentalists too. Why aren't we pushing for much more protection and enhancement of our natural resources too? Because they are to me, our very best techniques for fighting against climate change. So again, thank you so much, my friend Stephen, for coming. Thank you. Lovely to see all of you.
Nice to see you, Patricia.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Patricia. Those are really wise words, and I really don't want to add anything to them. That you just kind of summed it up so eloquently. So thank you.
Oh,
Absolutely.
thank you, my dear. Thank you.
It does make me think, what you said, Patricia, makes me think about one other area that's not quite a natural resource, but it's certainly an important industry involving resources is the agricultural industry.
Yes.
And now there's a push for regenerative farming and how money could be invested in there to make the soil itself such a good carbon sink for the future. And hopefully that will continue to grow as we move along. Mitchell Wilson mentions, asks what we can do to voice our opposition to the political protection of the fossil fuel industry through promotion of carbon capture. I know you've already touched on that a little bit. Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I think if there's anything I would want to stress, it's I guess maybe two things. One is that to try to when communicating with the government through letters or other means, to convey a sense that that there is at least some of the Canadian population that could imagine a future beyond fossil fuels, that don't see fossil fuels as always forever an essential part of the Canadian economy, that provides political support for a truly just transition that will enable people who work in the fossil fuel industry now to continue to have good jobs. And so that there is, active political support for supporting oil sands workers, say, that in a sense, people are on the same side as people who are working in Fort McMurray. They don't see them as like climate villains or something, but they are also Canadians as much as we are. And so we, communicate the extent that the idea that we are all ultimately on the same side. And so I would hope that people would frame their their communications to the government in that kind of a spirit, that of not in opposition necessarily, say, to the oil sands industry, but in collaboration with oil sands workers, that we also want to ensure that they are able to transition to a way of life that doesn't involve the destruction of the planet. And then the second thing I guess I would just say is I just wanted to reiterate one of the key points that I think that Patricia made, that kind of one thing I've seen, is kind of as an historian over the last 20 or 30 years of watching environmental activism, is the extent to which so much environmental activism has been kind of reduced to carbon, and on the one hand, that's kind of appropriate because climate change is a serious global emergency, but there's the whole rest of the environment that we also have to be concerned about the health of natural ecosystems and our relationship with the environment generally. So I think we have to try to always kind of embed activism about climate change within a larger kind of agenda of caring for nature, caring for the environment, reconsidering how we relate to the environment across all our activities and not just those that are directly relevant to carbon.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to pop in and mention that we do have on our website a resource about writing effective letters to the government. And also, I've had some very interesting conversations this winter. I felt like it was a full-time job calling the Ford government at a certain point. I don't know how many times I phoned, and each time I called, the person on the other end was like 100% with me. They were just like, this is great. Yep, keep going. I'm writing it all down. So calling representatives, I was always a little bit shy about it, but yeah, they were really good. So we've got a few more comments. It's 8:24. We'll see what we get through. Somebody's wondering, maybe I'll put these two together because they're both kind of options to cement. One is, might hemp replace cement? And then the other, Marilyn talks about a company in Montreal manufacturing cement blocks in which carbon is embedded. Might be better than sticking it in the ground. So I think these are both looking at like alternatives and new ways of doing things.
Yeah, that's interesting. There are various experiments underway to basically provide to turn cement into actually a carbon neutral or even kind of carbon positive technology. And that's promising for sure, as long as they can solve any possible problems in terms of the structural integrity of cement. We also want our buildings to be solid and, God help us, earthquake resilient and so forth. But certainly, those kinds of things are promising. there's, as Patricia said too, you know, there's no silver bullet out there. What there is, you know, thousands little particles that we all need to to use. You know, there's 1,000 solutions out there, not one big solution. And I think carbon positive cement would be one of those solutions, along with many other options.
We have a question here. Noreen Sylvester is asking, could you comment on how cap and trade and carbon credits compared to or relate to carbon capture in terms of their effectiveness, I guess?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that's an example of one role that government could play in terms of encouraging carbon capture, because it doesn't necessarily involve you know, a direct subsidy to industry that doesn't really need a subsidy. But what a carbon cap and trade mechanisms, as long as they're attached to a price on carbon that is set high enough to provide a genuine encouragement to industry to become more carbon efficient, it can be a way of sending kind of price signals to industry to encourage them to invest their own money in becoming more carbon efficient. So that can be, and if they aren't, then the carbon price will result in the industries paying carbon taxes towards the government, which then the revenue from the carbon tax could be used for investment in renewable energy or whatever other social priorities we had. So that's an example where, you know, the government can take, you know, kind of a role in shaping market forces in order to respond to a wider array of social priorities beyond simply maximum profit making.
Thanks. We've got a number of comment type comments. Richard Peachy says maybe we all have to write letters, which we've talked about. Connie McCracken says awesome presentation, Stephen. Thank you very much. Not quite sure I understand Kathleen Langley's, but I think I had to do with the poll at the beginning and her understanding of what went on there. Rosemary Ganley states an empowering evening. And we've got Patrick McCauley. You said that a letter to the government actually counts for 50 letters. Do you think this also applies when we sign a petition or an automated letter from an organization like Environmental Defense or the Ontario Clean Air Alliance?
Signing a petition or sending in one of those sort of pre-written letters, it's not nothing, but been hearing a lot of scuttlebutt lately to the effect that governments and like the Ontario provincial government, Doug Ford's government, has been making a lot of noises lately saying that, well, they don't pay any attention to those form letters. They just basically discount them. So it's basically, you know, governments are making a calculation that they evaluate how much investment went into producing the letter by the citizen. So if it's good to sign a petition or send in one of those form letters that, you know, Environmental Defense makes so you can send one in with just a single click. But certainly it's worth investing, if you can, in spending a few minutes sending a letter that is kind of more personalized, that just references your own experience in Peterborough or somewhere else, that makes it sound like an actual human rather than a communications specialist wrote the letter, right? So.
Okay, so I'm just going to wrap up here. There's 5 short little comments, and I don't want to miss what Cheryl Lyon's asking at the end. But just going back up, Linda Sunderland, thanks, Patricia. Well said. I think we can all second that. Thank you. Ruth Perkins mentioned the fight on to protect the Greenbelt from development, Bill 23, and that's still something worth writing a letter or phoning the government. Ruth also points out there's more people working in renewable energy than fossil fuels in Canada, and they're good paying jobs. That's really hopeful. And then Cheryl Lyon, do you want to speak up? And I don't want to say this wrong. I think Cheryl's the editor for the Green Zine magazine and is looking for contributors. Can you speak to that, Cheryl, please?
Thank you. Some of you may remember the Green Zine magazine that was put out for about 10 years by Transition Down Peterborough. We've moved online. It's certainly not the same thing as the very beautiful paper magazine we used to put out, but I'm just drawing your attention to it. The Green Zine online, all one word.com. And we're looking for contributors. Submission guidelines are on the website. Thank you.
And even if you're not a contributor, there's some really well-written articles on there. You can browse through the previous articles. And Kate Grierson, very informative. Thank you. So here we are at 8:31. I didn't think we'd get through those all. A lot of people had a lot of things to say, but thank you all for coming and participating and asking such great questions and sharing such great ideas. There's clearly a lot of interest in this topic. I feel like we just sort of scratched the surface. So, you know, we're starting to think about our presentations for our G Meets for next year. So if anyone has any topics or sort of another slant on this, anyone knows anyone who would like to come and do a presentation for us, please reach out to us and share your ideas. We would appreciate that. So thank you, everyone. And thank you so much, Stephen, for your time in preparing and presenting this evening. It was amazing.
Well, thank you, everyone, for your attention. I've appreciated this opportunity. So thank you.
Great.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.